I was standing in my driveway, just brushing some gray, greasy soot off the rim of my mailbox when the fire marshal walked over and delivered the news that changed everything. And he didn't sugarcoat it. He just looked me dead in the eye and told me they were ruling it as arson. He said the accelerant had been poured specifically along the base of my back porch, right where the wood was oldest and driest. And he told me that whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, which is a hell of a thing to hear when you spend your whole life serving the law. My name is Elias Thorne, and for 12 years, I've lived in a quiet little pocket of Silver Creek, Georgia, just a simple man who did 20 years in the Navy, retired as a commander, and then spent the last decade wearing black robes as a federal judge. I'm the kind of guy who keeps his lawn trimmed to a crisp 2 inches, pays his taxes 3 weeks early, and generally mind his own business. But apparently, in this neighborhood, minding your own business is considered a high crime if you aren't paying for the privilege. It all started about 3 months ago on a Tuesday that felt like any other until I heard this sharp, entitled rapping at my front door. And when I opened it, I was met with a woman who looked like she'd been born with a clipboard in one hand and a bottle of lemon-scented entitlement in the other. Her name was Diane Sterling, the self-appointed queen bee of the Silver Creek Heights Homeowners Association. And before I could even say hello, she was squinting at my porch light like it was a personal insult to her ancestors. She told me I was the last holdout, on the street, the only one who had an oppos. T joined their little club, and she said it was time I stopped being drain on community cohesion, Now, I've dealt with cartels and white-collar sociopaths in my courtroom, so a woman with a power bob and a sensible cardigan was an oppos. T about to rattle me. So I just crossed my arms and told her that when I bought this house a decade ago, there was no HOA, and I certainly didn't in oppos. T sign any covenant. She didn't in oppos. T like that one bit. Her face turned a shade of red that almost matched her lipstick as she explained that they'd passed retroactive motion that automatically enrolled all homeowners after 90 days of residence, whether they liked it or not. I couldn't in oppos. T help it, I actually laughed, and I told her Diane, I'm a federal judge, and I'm telling you right now that you can in oppos. T retroactively force a contract on a private citizen who never agreed to the terms, not unless you're looking to get laughed out of court and sued into the Stone Age, She didn't in oppos. T say in other words, she just turned on her heel and stomped off, but I could feel the heat radiating off her back, and I knew right then that I just declared war on the most dangerous person in the suburbs, a woman with too much time on her hands and a burning need for control. Over the next month, the citations started arriving like clockwork. Every single morning I'd find a little yellow slip tucked under my wiper blade or taped to my door, claiming my mailbox was a non-standard shade of obsidian or that my gravel was irregularly shaped, It was absurd, it was petty, and it was clearly meant to break me. But what Diane didn't in oppos, T realized, is that Navy veterans don in oppos. T break, we just get more methodical. One night, I caught a shadow on my doorbell cam, a tall, rangy guy in a hoodie who was systematically slashing my tires while humming a show tune, and thanks to the high-def lens, I caught the license plate of the truck waiting at the curb. It was registered to Diane's husband's construction company. I took that footage to the local precinct, but the officer just shrugged and said it looked like neighborly friction and told me to try and work it out over a barbecue, which was when I realized the rot in this town went deeper than just a few busybodies on a board. 2 weeks later, I was driving home from a particularly grueling sentencing hearing, thinking about nothing but a cold beer and my golden retriever, Barnaby, when I turned the corner and saw the smoke, a thick, oily black plume that was choking the sunset. By the time I jumped out of my car, the back half of my house was a skeleton of orange embers, and the sound was like a freight train of glass breaking, a roar that stays in your ears long after the flames are gone. Thank God Barnaby was at the groomers that afternoon, because if he'd been inside, there wouldn't have been enough of Diane Sterling left for a trial. But as it stood, I just stood there in my suit, watching 12 years of memories turn into gray flakes that drifted down like snow. The fire marshal, a good man named Miller, was the one who confirmed it was professional work. He told me the person who said it knew the layout of the gas lines and used a specific mixture of racing fuel and kerosene to ensure it went up fast. But here's the thing about Diane and her little circle of bullies. They thought I was just a lonely old man with a law degree, a paper tiger they could scare away with a match. They didn't into Oppos. T know that 3 days before the fire, I'd already filed a RICO-style civil suit in federal court, documenting every single instance of extortion, property damage, and stalking, and I had a private investigator who'd spent 2 weeks digging into the HOA's bank accounts. While I was standing there in the ashes, Diane actually had the audacity to walk over, clutching a pashmina to her throat and looking in quote, horrified in quote, and she whispered in quote, "Oh, Elias, what a tragedy. Maybe if you'd been part of the association, we would have had the budget for better street patrols," end quote. I just looked at her, my face as cold as the marble in my chambers, and I said, end quote, "Diane, you spent so much time looking at my lawn that you forgot to look at the law, and I suggest you go home and pack a bag, because the U.S. Marshals are going to be at your door by sunrise," end quote. The look on her face was worth every cent of my deductible. It was a mixture of confusion and genuine, soul-deep terror as she realized I wasn't into Oppos. T just some guy she could find into submission. The next morning, I wasn't into Oppos. T at the hotel eating continental breakfast. I was in a secure conference room at the federal building with Detective Miller and a forensic accountant named Sarah, looking at a whiteboard that laid out a criminal enterprise masquerading as a neighborhood board. It turned out that the end quote, retroactive dues and quote, Diane had been collecting wearing and Oppos. T going toward the community pool or the landscaping. They were being funneled through a shell company called, end quote, Sterling Solutions, end quote, to pay off the gambling debts of the HOA treasurer and to hire local thugs to, end quote, encourage, end quote, people to sell their homes at a loss. They were targeting the elderly, the people who couldn't and Oppos. T fight back, and when they hit me, they hit a wall of pure, unadulterated justice. We found a guy from the doorbell cam, the one who'd slashed my tires, a kid named Caleb who worked for Diane's husband, and once he realized he was looking at a federal arson charge that carried a mandatory minimum of 20 years, he sang like a bird in springtime. He told us Diane had told him to, end quote, light a small fire, end quote, to scare me out, but he'd gotten nervous and used too much fuel, and he even had the text messages to prove it, because criminals these days just can't end Oppos. T help, but leave a digital breadcrumb trail. The arrest happened on a bright Saturday morning, right in the middle of the neighborhood's annual, end quote, spring fling, end quote, bake sale, and I made sure I was there, leaning against my rental car with a cup of coffee in my hand. Watching the handcuffs click shut over Diane's manicured wrists while she screamed about her rights was the most satisfying thing I've seen in 30 years of legal practice, and when the U.S. Attorney's Office added the racketeering and attempted murder charges, the rest of the board started turning on each other before they even reached the precinct. For the next 6 months, I lived in a small apartment while my house was rebuilt from the ground up, but I wasn't into Oppos. T just sitting around, I was helping the other residents of Silver Creek Heights file for restitution. We discovered that at least 4 families had lost their homes to, end quote, predatory liens, end quote, created by Diane and her cronies, and we managed to get every single one of those foreclosures overturned, returning the equity to the people who actually earned it. The HOA was dissolved by a court order, stripped of its power and its assets. And in its place, we form a voluntary neighborhood watch that actually focuses on watching out for each other instead of measuring the height of someone's mailbox. The day I finally moved back into the new house, it was raining, a soft, cleansing Georgia rain that washed away the last of the smoke smell that had lingered in my nostrils for half a year. I kept the design simple, brick, stone, and a reinforced back porch that's built to withstand a hell of a lot more than a gallon of racing fuel. And I put a plaque near the front door that simply says, end quote, justice is the only foundation that lasts, end quote. My neighbor from across the street, a quiet woman named Martha who had been paying Diane's, end quote, protection fees, end quote, for 5 years, came over with a pie and told me that for the first time in a decade, she felt like she actually owned her own dirt. That's the thing about power. It only works if you're afraid to lose what you have. But once they burn it all down, you realize they have no leverage left, and that's when you become their worst nightmare. Now, Brenda, or Diane, or whatever her name is this week in the prison system, is serving 12 years in a federal facility, and I hear she's already tried to start an HOA in the cell block to regulate the color of the jumpsuits. But the warden wasn't into oppos, T as in quote, cooperative in quote, as the local cops. I'm back on the bench now, and every time a case comes across my desk involving a small-town bully or a group of people who think the rules don into oppos, T apply to them, I think about that sit on my mailbox and I remember why I wear the robe. But I have to ask you, because I see this happening all over the country, at what point does a community become a cage, and why do we give so much power to people whose only qualification is that they have nothing better to do than hate your paint color? Was I right to take it to the federal level and dismantle the whole thing, or should I have just moved out and let the next victim deal with it? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that a neighborhood is only as good as the people who are willing to stand up for it, even when the world is on fire.